currently I'm affiliated with the USS Pawnee Marine Guard reenactors, which was another Civil War gunboat that I'll talk about. So this talk is kind of based on a chapter in my book, which talks about, you know, the naval actions on the St. Johns River. For better or for worse, most of the story of the Navy in the Civil War here in Florida was the Union Navy. Very early in the war, the Confederate government pretty much decided to abandon Florida, so there was very little Confederate naval activity here in Florida. I've tried to dredge out everything I could, and all I've been able to find was some Confederate gunboat activity on the Apalachicola River out of Columbus, Georgia, and then in the port of St. Marks, at the mouth of the St. Marks River, the Confederate Navy gunboat CSS Spray, the only Confederate Navy gunboat stationed in Florida during the war. But so this talks about all what went on Navy-wise on the St. Johns River. So again, this is the website that I contributed to. It's actually still, you can still go to it, but nobody's contributed to it since 2015. It was active during the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and I was a contributing blogger, and just based on the research that I did for my blog posts, which was pretty much all on Florida and Georgia actions, that was kind of the inspiration for me writing my book. So kind of starting with the big picture, and then we'll focus down on the St. Johns River. When the war broke out, when the Civil War broke out, President Lincoln appointed Gideon Welles as his Navy Secretary, and President Jefferson Davis appointed Stephen Russell Mallory as his Naval Secretary. Welles was always one of Lincoln's kind of favorite cabinet members. He respected the president. He did not covet the president's job like some of Lincoln's other cabinet members. Mallory is interesting because he's a Florida connection. He was born in Trinidad, but he grew up in Key West, Florida, and that's where he went into maritime law. Back then, wrecking, trying to salvage wrecks on the reefs in the Florida Keys was a big industry. So he got involved with the legality of that kind of thing, and then eventually he was appointed to, along with David Levy Yulee, he represented Florida in the U.S. Senate, and of course he left when Florida seceded from the Union, and Davis appointed him his Navy Secretary because of his maritime experience, and he also chaired the Senate Committee on Naval Affairs when he was in the U.S. Senate. So those were the guys who kind of ran things. The main job of the Union Navy throughout the Civil War was to implement the blockade of the southern coast that President Lincoln had declared shortly after the firing on Fort Sumter. The Union blockade consisted of 4 coastal blockading squadrons plus a Mississippi River squadron which worked with the West Gulf Squadron. The ones in yellow here, the South Atlantic, East Gulf, and West Gulf squadrons were all involved with the blockade of Florida. And there's the map. So northeast Florida, off our coast here, was patrolled by ships of the South Atlantic. Most of the Florida coast was patrolled by the East Gulf Squadron, and from St. Andrews Bay to the Alabama line was the West Gulf Squadron. Major activities of the Union Navy in Florida were, again, to implement the blockade, which meant intercepting or going after, cutting out blockade runners to disrupt that activity. But there was also a lot of shore party raids. Naval landing parties of sailors and Marines would go ashore to bust up salt works and other manufacturing facilities, capture material, and free slaves. There was a lot of joint Navy-Army activities in Florida. That was mainly how the Union Army got around, was the Army brought them around and brought them up rivers. The Union Navy also, there were quite a bit of Union sympathizers here in Florida, Unionists, that the Union Navy supported, and they actually helped support and develop resistance movements here in Florida, guerrilla activities. In terms of the Confederate Navy, their major Florida activities, like I mentioned, was little to none. You know, Florida had no major ports like Charleston, South Carolina, or Mobile, Alabama. As I mentioned, the Confederate leadership decided, because of Florida's extensive coastline and the ease with which the Union could land, you know, landing parties, the Confederate leadership pretty much decided they were not spend military resources defending Florida. And there was no real major naval presence in the war, other than, like I mentioned, some Confederate Navy gunboat activity on the Apalachicola River and the CSS Spray in the harbor of St. Mark's. So when we really drill down to what was happening here in Northeast Florida, the Union blockade arrived off the St. Johns River in the latter part of 1861 with the arrival of the sidewheel steam gunboat USS Beanville. Because of the need for ships, you know, throughout the war, a lot of the Union Navy and Confederate Navy ships were converted civilian merchant vessels. They weren't purpose-built gunboats or warships. So the Union Navy ended up purchasing huge numbers of civilian vessels of all different types and just kind of beefing up their decks to mount the heavy deck guns on them. And so the Beanville was one of those. It was a former merchant steamer. It arrived off the mouth of the St. Johns River in 1861, actually captured a couple of blockade runners trying to run out. In November of 1861, the Union Navy took Port Royal, South Carolina, to establish a main base further south than Hampton Roads, Virginia. So they would have a base of operations. And then they continued to move south. In early March, they retook Fort Clinch at Fernandina and the town of Fernandina. And a couple days later, a Union Navy squadron arrived off the mouth of the St. Johns in March of 1862. A few days later, they were able to cross the river bar at the mouth of the river during a high tide and head upriver. The first occupation of Jacksonville occurred on March 12th. And eventually, the Union Navy established a small base of operations at a little town, what was then called Mayport Mills, which of course is current-day Mayport, at the mouth of the St. Johns River. And that was kind of their base from which they did patrols on the St. Johns River. By the early part of 1862, the Union Navy pretty much controlled the St. Johns River up to Lake George. Again, March 12th was the first occupation of Jacksonville. The Navy helped land the 4th New Hampshire Infantry there. The next day, the gunboat USS Ottawa conducted a probe up the St. Johns River. They ended up at Palatka, and there's actually some evidence. I belong to the Presbyterian Church, and the minutes of the session say on March 14th, 1862, the enemy entered Palatka. That was the arrival of the gunboat Ottawa. You know, folks woke up on March 14th, and they see this big black-hulled warship flying the Stars and Stripes, anchoring off the town. There was a occasional blockade runner, Captain Richard Adams, who worked for the Confederacy, and he wrote in his journal, "Federal gunboat arrived, Palatka, 8:30 a.m. I took to the woods." He thought they were going to be after him. So that was the arrival of the Ottawa at Palatka. And a few days later, the commander of this gunboat, Lieutenant Thomas Holdup Stevens, wrote his report to his admiral, Flag Officer DuPont. Since my last communication, I have made a reconnaissance, that's how they spelled it back then, as far as Palatka, found no hostile demonstrations, and in fact, through much of the war, the Union Navy tried to assure the citizens along the river that they were not there to implement a reign of terror. You know, if they were not attacked, they would not attack civilians. And in fact, they actually ended up providing some support to the civilians as, you know, food became scarcer and just things became harder to live during the Civil War. This was just a few days later, Stevens' report to his commanding officer. There is a link, some of you may know this, between the premier trophy in yacht racing, the America's Cup, and the St. Johns River. in the middle, in like the 1850s, a group of New York investors had a very fast schooner built, a two-masted schooner. It had a radical new hull design, which gave it a much more hydrodynamic effect to cut through the water. And so they recruited a crew, and this boat went over to England and participated in a race around the British Islands for a trophy, back then called variously the Queen's Cup or other things. And at the time, they beat the pants off the English, who at that time were considered to be the finest sailors in the world. This was the very first schooner yacht America. After the war, it was sold to an English citizen who renamed it the Camilla. And when the Civil War broke out, he decided to engage in blockade running. And so he ran some supplies into Jacksonville on this schooner. And then there was much partying and celebration and all. But while they were doing that, the Union Navy arrived off the mouth of the St. Johns River and pretty much sealed it off. If you've ever been to the mouth of the St. Johns River, it's not real wide. I mean, one gunboat can pretty much seal off the river. It's not today, and it wasn't back then either. So he sold the yacht to the Confederate government. They dismasted it, and they towed the hull upriver of Palatka to Dunn's Creek, where they sunk it. They scuttled it in Dunn's Creek. Somehow the Union Navy found out about this, because this was a famous ship. What they did to beat the British in their own territory, in their own race, was pretty, earth-shattering. And the Union Navy found out about this, and Lieutenant Stevens of the Ottawa sent a salvage party up to Dunn's Creek to raise the hull, and eventually it went back to Jacksonville, spent the rest of the war mainly off Charleston as a blockading vessel, and then was a training vessel for the Naval Academy. But so the very first schooner yacht America, which won this trophy, which became the America's Cup because America just kept winning it again and again and again and again, spent some time in the St. Johns River. So that's the link between the America's Cup and the St. Johns River. So probably the big main naval action on the St. Johns River was in the late summer of 1862. The Confederates, in an effort to stop the Union Navy's free use of the St. Johns River, they constructed some heavy batteries on St. John's Bluff, which is a fairly high promontory overlooking the river in the area of the current day Fort Caroline Memorial. That's St. John's Bluff there. So they constructed this battery to blast away at Union gunboats using the river. It was completed by early September of 1862. A slave who worked on the battery was able to escape, and he made his way down to Mayport Mills to inform the naval commanders down there about the existence of this battery. Much of where the battery was located is now a subdivision, St. John's Bluff Estates it's called, but there's a little public park with the Ribot Monument after the Frenchman, Jean Ribot, kind of right in the middle of that subdivision, which I think is close to where the battery would have been. So there's a picture I took from that park. There's me as a Reb artilleryman, but you can kind of see, this is looking downriver on the St. John's. You can see the command this battery would have had over ship movement on the St. John's River. So the naval commander down there at Mayport was not too sure about the information he was receiving from escaped slaves. So on September 11th, he sent 2 of his gunboats up the river to kind of reconnoiter and probe things. They arrived in the area of the battery in the evening of September 10th, and they anchored up for the night. The next morning, September 11th, the battery opened fire on the gunboats. So they exchanged fire for most of the morning until the gunboats just began to run out of ammo. So they headed back to Mayport Mills. The commander down there, the ranking naval officer on the St. John's, Steedman, so he sent a larger force a few days later upriver. The 2 big double-ender gunboats, the Paul Jones and the Cimarron, along with the Hale, the Patroon, and the Uncas, and they got into a big firefight with the battery. One of the things that was interesting about the Civil War, masonry structures, like Fort Pulaski, Fort Sumter, Fort Clinch and all, they were becoming obsolete because of the advances in naval gunnery, plus steam-powered ships were not at the mercy of the wind. They could move independently. So, Fort Pulaski was absolutely devastated by Union gunfire, both Navy and Army. Fort Sumter was devastated by Confederate gunfire. But the earthworks were remarkably resistant to gunfire because those big earthen walls, whether it was an exploding shell or not, they could just absorb it and not be destroyed like a masonry structure. So whether it's Fort Fisher in North Carolina, Fort Wagner in South Carolina, Fort McAllister in Georgia, these were all earthworks, or the Confederate earthworks at St. John's Bluff were remarkably resistant to heavy gunfire. Again, went on for a few hours. The ships basically exhausted their ammunition and had to retire. They did, in both cases, drive the Confederates out of the earthworks, but then they reoccupied them. So the Union leadership realized that it's going to take a joint Navy-Army operation to take this battery. And so 1,500 Union soldiers were sent down from Port Royal in early October. They were landed a couple days later downstream of the battery and started to work their way towards the battery on the bluff. The Confederate commander of the battery really kind of overestimated the size of this force. He thought it was more like 5,000 soldiers, and he felt like there's no way I can resist a force like that. So he and his men did abandon the battery. Naval Landing Party occupied it on October 3rd and turned it over to the Army. So that and then they basically just dismantled the whole thing. There was another secondary battery upriver that the Confederates constructed at Yellow Bluff across the river. That was also abandoned about the same time. So that was kind of the big naval action on the river. So really after that kind of really opened things up where there were multiple Union forays up the river. They basically destroyed every vessel they could find or captured it because there were no bridges across the river, so that's what the Confederates used to get back and forth was scows and flatboats and that kind of thing. So the gunboats involved included the Cimarron, the Water Witch, and the Hale. Early in 1862, the Union captured the Confederate steamer Darlington. This was a civilian vessel. It wasn't a Confederate gunboat. And they turned it into a lot of their captures, they turned them into blockading vessels. They sent the now called the USS Darlington, again, a captured Confederate steamer, up the river to capture another small Confederate steamer, the Governor Milton. Which they found and captured near Hawkinsville, which is a town that no longer exists, but it was in the current-day DeLand area. So Union Navy expeditions up the river to capture and destroy Confederate vessels. There was another expedition later in 1864, the Columbine, actually made it all the way up to Lake Monroe, and they captured the Confederate steamer Hattie. The Hattie and the Darlington were both owned by a fairly well-known St. Johns River steamboat captain, Jacob Brock. Those were both his boats. He allied himself with the Confederacy and ran supplies for the Confederates along the river. And so both of his steamboats ended up getting captured. He got the Darlington back after the war and resumed his steamboat traffic on the river. He had a big fancy hotel built up on Lake Monroe, the little town of Enterprise on the north shore of Lake Monroe. So this was an expedition way up the river. Like I say, the Union mainly controlled up to Lake George. Up above there was, that was more Confederate territory. Really, much of the naval Civil War was a river war. It was a war fought on the rivers, whether it was on the Mississippi River or up the Atlantic East Coast rivers, and even here in Florida, the naval actions up the rivers. Interesting enough, the U.S. Navy, the next time they fought a river war, a brown water war, was 100 years later, Vietnam. They actually went back and looked at the reports from the guys in the Civil War to see how did we do that, And they did it by sort of adapting all sorts of unusual vessels. In Vietnam you had the PBRs and the Swift boats, and they even took the old Higgins boats and turned them into these monitor type things to go up the rivers of Vietnam to engage in that war. Of course, the Rebs fought back. I know some of you are probably aware of this. In November of 1862, a naval landing party went ashore at Magnolia Springs, just north of here. There was a big resort owned by Dr. Benedict, who in general was friendly towards the Union, but this landing party was ambushed by a bunch of rebel guerrillas. It was thought that maybe Benedict had been forced to, sort of entice the naval landing party ashore to try to get ambushed. Amazingly, no Union sailors were killed. When the Uncas, this was the gunboat, got back to Mayport Mills, by this time a guy named Woodhull was the ranking commander on the St. John's. He wanted to come up and just shell the crap out of the resort, but his commander DuPont said, no, just don't worry about it for now. So nothing ever happened. I think this is after the war, but there's the Magnolia Springs Resort. It was one of the springs resorts, just like here at Green Cove and many of the other springs, here in Florida, that were kind of the spas for a while. Of course, probably the most infamous is in May of 1864, the gunboat Columbine, USS Columbine, was on the way back downriver from going upriver to investigate whether a Union force up at Astor, Fort Volusia, was being threatened. They weren't. So on its way back down, it was ambushed by Confederate cavalry captain John Jackson Dickinson at Horse Landing on the St. Johns River. This was the Battle of Horse Landing. He had a couple of artillery pieces and sharpshooters, and as the gunboat came downriver, the channel, it had to kind of come close to shore following the deeper channel, because the St. John's has a lot of those big shallow shoals like you see here going 100 yards out into the river. And so that's where Dickinson was able to ambush the boat. A number of sailors were killed. He ended up capturing the boat. I think he actually did want to take it and turn it over to the Savannah Confederate Naval Squadron, the Savannah Squadron up in Georgia. But he was afraid, a couple days before actually, he had attacked the larger gunboat Ottawa and busted it up pretty good. But he was afraid the noise he made ambushing the Columbine, the Ottawa and other gunboats would have been coming to rescue them. So he took the deck guns off the boat, all the small arms, the muskets and pistols and cutlasses and all, and the rowboat, the ship's boat. He took those and then he burned it. We have at the Putnam County Historical Museum a small collection of artifacts that were recovered off the Columbine. So that's one of our exhibits. So now Palatka people like to say, well, this is the only time in history that an Army force actually ambushed and sank a Union U.S. Navy gunboat. Actually, it wasn't. Several months later, in October of 1864, out on the Tennessee or Cumberland River, Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest did the same thing. He ambushed a Union Navy force on the river. He actually ended up capturing the gunboat and a couple of transports and tried to convert it into Forrest's Little River Navy, but the Union Navy was able to recapture those. But one of the urban legends is that somehow he had read or heard about what Dickinson had done, and either he was inspired to duplicate the feat or he didn't want some Florida cracker to get all that glory. I don't think either one. I just think Dickinson and Forrest were the same kind of a guy. So there was that.
Rob,
yes.
I'm sorry, quick question if that's okay.
Yeah.
Where is Horse Landing? Is that close to Palatka?
It's upstream of Palatka. Do you know where the Roadheaver Boys Ranch is?
No, I'm
kind
not
of
familiar.
Okay, but it's kind of in the area where the Roadheaver Boys Ranch is. which is kind of south, upstream of Palatka. Yeah.
19.
So, the other big thing that happened on the St. Johns River, and kind of the three things that Mallory did as the Confederate Navy Secretary, is he kind of advanced some of the emerging naval technologies. He, used ironclad warships to try to go up against the overwhelming firepower of the Union Navy. He looked at doing submersible type vessels, not only the Hunley, which is the most famous, but these other vessels, which were kind of these torpedo boats called the Davids. And then the third thing he did, in conjunction with Matthew Fontaine Maury, who was a naval officer who went to the Confederate Navy, they advanced the science of what were then called torpedoes, what today we would call mines, mine warfare. So the Confederate Navy used mining of the harbors and such as a defense against Union Navy incursions into their harbors. And in early 1864, at that time, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard was in charge of the defenses of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and he ordered the mining of the St. Johns River. He sent a couple of his guys down to work with the Confederate Navy to plant mines on the St. Johns River. The first big set was planted in the Mandarin Point area, and on April 1st of 1864, the Union transport Maple Leaf was on its way back to Jacksonville from Palatka, and they hit one of those mines, and the Maple Leaf sank. As you all know, the Mandarin Museum has a marvelous collection of artifacts harvested off the Maple Leaf. A few weeks later, another Union transport was sunk in the same area, the General Hunter, and two other Union transports were sunk on the St. Johns River during the course of 1864, 1865, the latter part of the war. These things, the psychological effect was greater actually than the physical effect of destroying and sinking ships. The sailors were just terrified of these things. They dubbed them the infernal machines. But there were Navy patrols, to try to find these things, drag them up, disarm them, that kind of thing. So that's that's more or less the end of it. By the latter part of 1864, early 1865, the war was cranking down, and so that really the torpedoes were sort of the last gasp of the Confederate defenses of the St. John's River. So just a little bit. Again, when I kind of first got into this hobby, I joined a group called the USS Fort Henry Living History Association. Like John said, the Fort Henry was a New York City ferry boat. The Union Navy bought a number of them. They were very useful for working. They had a shallow draft, so they could go over the river bars, up the rivers. Because it was a ferry boat, it could go forward and backward. They didn't have to turn around. So they were very handy. They would basically just mount some heavy guns on each end. These were all side wheel steamers. They had two big side wheels. The Fort Henry served in the East Gulf Blockading Squadron along the Gulf Coast between Tampa Bay and the St. Marks River. It was one of the gunboats involved with landing the troops at St. Marks, which eventually became the Battle of Natural Bridge, which is one of our two big reenactments here in Florida. There are no known pictures of the Fort Henry. This is the Commodore Barney, but the Fort Henry would have looked very, very similar. Kind of similar, to the Vietnam gunboats. You can see they had these iron plates that they could flip up to protect the gun crews from small arms fire, muskets and pistols, kind of things, as they were going their way along the river. And so, of course, we don't have a boat, but what we would do is we would portray at events a Union naval landing party, either one which went ashore independently or went ashore with the Army to help support the Army. You can kind of see the various uniforms. This was the typical deck seaman's uniform, the dark blue frock, the blue trousers, and the flat hat. Sometimes they could wear white trousers. on special occasions like Sunday inspections and all, they'd be in the white frock. But that was not good for working because it got dirty, you know, and showed dirt real easily. And so, again, eventually, you know, everybody got old or left the hobby, so the Fort Henry kind of went away as an organization. So, again, I'm now affiliated with the Pawnee, which the Pawnee was a purpose-built gunboat, what's called a steam sloop of war. Had 3 fore-and-aft masts, but it also had a steam engine driving a screw. Was armed with a broadside of weapons on each deck. It served in the South Atlantic Squadron, mainly off the Carolina coast, Carolina and Georgia, although it did spend some time here in Florida. And a crew from the Pawnee took the steamer Darlington up to capture the Governor Milton, that Confederate steamer that I talked about. So they did see some service in Florida, including on the St. Johns River. There's a very famous deck scene of the Pawnee. Again, you can see the guys are pretty much dressed just like me. This was the standard working deck uniform. There was a broadside of Dahlgren deck guns. This was actually a Confederate howitzer that they captured in an action up in the Carolinas. And again, you know, most of the guys are Marines, but we got a few sailors, including me. So one of our big events is the Natural Bridge reenactment, which is always that first weekend of March. We go on the field. We actually, you know, like Olustee, this is actually fought on the real battlefield. This is the monument at the Natural Bridge Battlefield Historic State Park, and there's another sailor with me. So again, we portray a naval landing party. I was mentioning to John, this event unfortunately no longer occurs, but it used to occur out in Panama City, where we would actually do a saltworks raid. You know, we would do a landing on St. Andrews Bay and assault a works to bust it up. Salt, and you know, Pat sent me an article from Clay County here. You know, we don't, nowadays salt, you know, you think of, you sprinkle it on your baked potato, your French fries or whatever. For a long time, one of the most valuable commodities was salt. I mean, right up there with gold and silver and everything, because that was what was used to preserve food, along with other important uses. It's a mineral for livestock, for tanning hides, making leather, that kind of thing. And so when the Civil War broke out, the Confederacy mostly got their salt imported, either from the North or from the Bahamas or something like that, or from Europe, salt mines in Europe. And the blockade, of course, cut that off. So salt making, taking salt water and boiling it down to get the salt, became a major industry in Florida during the Civil War. And salt was a major commodity produced here in Florida. And so the Union Navy, just to try to disrupt that, would lots of saltworks raids. St. Andrews was a particularly epicenter of salt production, because unlike a lot of the other big bays in the Panhandle, it doesn't have a big river running into it. Because like when the Apalachicola River floods, Apalachicola Bay practically turns fresh. You know, there's no salt in it, so you can't boil it out. But St. Andrews Bay just has a few little creeks running into it. So it was salty throughout the year, plus also they had ready access to railroads up in the Panhandle, so they could get the product out to where it was needed. You know, the Indian River Lagoon would have been a great place for salt making, but there was no way to get the product because it was so remote, you know, down on the Florida East Coast. And then I got to give a plug for our local event in Palatka. It's always the last full weekend of September, the occupation of Palatka. It occurs on the historic site. There's the Historical Museum, and the Bronson House is next door here. Bronson House, there's the Bronson House, was constructed by Judge Isaac Bronson in the 1850s. He was an abolitionist, and they actually went back up to New York during the war. But the house was occupied early in the war by Confederate forces. And then after the Battle of Olustee, which was a defeat for the Union force, they retreated back to Jacksonville. And then they got worried that, you know, there's this big Confederate army now in Florida that drove us back. they're going to go on the offensive and try to drive the Union out of Northeast Florida. Because, you know, by 1862, the Union took Fernandina, they took Jacksonville, they took St. Augustine, they took Palatka, so they pretty much controlled that whole Northeast Florida. So they kept, you know, a bunch of guys at Jacksonville, but then they sent a force up to Fernandina to reinforce Fort Clinch. They sent a force to St. Augustine to reinforce the Castillo, which was Fort Marion, and they sent Barton's New York Brigade to Palatka. And they actually camped on these grounds here. Colonel Barton and his officers stayed in the Bronson House. The guys camped. Around the corner is St. Mark's Episcopal Church. A number of the Union soldiers commandeered the church, which had been abandoned by the congregation. And they are open. The church is open during this weekend. So we'll have period camps and reenactors on the grounds. The Bronson House is open. The museum is open. I've got a big kind of Navy display because it's right next to the river. So, you know, we had the gunboats on the river. So this year it's going to be starting Friday, October 26th, which is September 26th, which is our school day, and then Saturday and Sunday, September 27th and 28th. So certainly you're invited to come see us. And here's some of the websites that I use. Again, the Sesquicentennial, you can still get it. The U.S. Navy, this is an official U.S. Navy website. A lot of my photographs come from them. They have a huge historic photograph collection. I also get the Library of Congress and the Florida Memory Project. And then the Navy and Marine Living History Association. That's another big reenactors group. They've got a lot of stuff on their website. So I've also kind of recently gotten into World War II stuff because, as some of you know, we've got the USS Orleck up in Jacksonville, which I still need to get up and visit them, and I want to see if I could do some docent work up there on that ship. And then I am retired. John mentioned I was for 40 years an environmental scientist, aquatic biologist here in Florida, mainly working for 2 of our water management districts. I retired in 2022, and I've been scratching all sorts of itches, among which I joined the Coast Guard Auxiliary, which is the kind of the volunteer support arm of the U.S. Coast Guard. This is up at Coast Guard Station Mayport. And so that does it. I will be happy to answer any questions. So yeah, a little bit. So this is kind of the standard uniform of a working deck seaman. Back then, the scarf actually had a use. It was meant to be used kind of as a sweat towel. Nowadays, it's more decorative for the uniform. This is called a fall front. This cut the trousers. The main thing is, you know, between the tie in the back and the fall front, the trousers stayed up. You didn't need suspenders because, as you saw, a lot of the warships still had masts and such. So a belt or suspenders could get stuck, you know, and he could fall out of the mast or that kind of thing. So that's why they had this kind of thing. I know they still have the fall front today, but it's decorative. It's just part of the sort of traditional dress uniform. Some of the stuff I've got here that you can come up and look at. Your typical soldier was armed either like you've seen Civil War, typical sailor was armed either like you see the soldiers with the musket and the bayonet. So he'd have his belt rig and then his long arm and a bayonet, or with the pistol and cutlass. It kind of depended on the nature of the mission, whether the sailors were armed with musket and bayonet or pistol and cutlass.
Do that again, I'm sorry.
So, this was one of the standard pistols used by the Navy through much of the war. This was the model 1851 Navy Colt, 36 caliber. In part, that's what made it a Navy. This is what was worn on the belt. It's called a pistol frog. So you'd have, you know, the pistol here and the cutlass on the left hip. At the beginning of the war, this was the Navy cutlass that was on most ships, the model 1841, and then it was replaced by the model 1860 Navy cutlass. And these are what they used to practice. Okay, these were called single sticks, so they were part of the arms locker, and these are what the guys would use to practice on using the cutlass. Typically a couple times a week for a couple hours, the sailors would do cutlass drill under the supervision of an officer. And then, of course, the sailors, fought, but then they also operated and maintained the ship. So these are some of the tools they would use. Again, most of the ships had a sail rig, masts and sails, so they had a sailmaker's division. This is a sailor's palm used for forcing the needles. We've got some sailmaker's needles here through the heavy canvas, and then some other sailmaker's tools, something used for just basting down the seams, a seam rubber, and an awl for punching holes in leather and canvas. Most of the ships were wood, so they had a carpenter's division. This is a woodworking tool. Some of you recognize it. Folks call it a spoke shaver. And then draw knives and drills, and I've got a variety of other tools. And then a well-trained seaman had a variety of rope and knot skills, one of which included splicing. This is a splice, which I did not do. I'm trying to teach myself. An old Navy chief made me my Civil War sea bag here. That's a splice, and these were the tools they used to splice. It's called a fig. Okay? And then just a canteen. This is a caulking hammer. Again, the ships were wood. They had a wooden deck. They had to keep the deck seams caulked to try to keep the interior of the ship dry. So this was used for pounding the caulk into the seams. There are some other tools that were part of the caulking kit that I'm trying to find. There were metal and kind of various kinds of awls and things for scraping out the old caulk and applying the new caulk. This is a caulking hammer. A heaving line with a monkey's fist for tossing to the dock to tow the heavy mooring lines over to the dock to moor the ships. And then, well, two things. Okay, some of y'all might recognize that, the bosun's pipe, okay? Okay? Still used today. Well, back then it actually had a practical use. Again, the ships had masts that the sailors would have to go up to work the masts. If there were more than a strong breeze blowing, the sound of the wind through the rigging would be so loud that voice commands couldn't carry up to the tops. So, the officer of the deck would issue an order, shorten sail 2 points, and a bosun's mate, the bosun and his bosun's mates who ran the deck, one would go to the base of each mast and do a signal which would penetrate. The sailors could hear that, just like bugle calls in the Army. They'd use the bugle calls to tell the soldiers what to do because they were spread over hundreds of acres. And then Pat asked me to bring my harmonicas because, the sailors, when they're in their downtime, they would sing, they would sing ballads and various other songs. Of course, there were the working songs too, which they would sing to help them, coordinate hauling on the heavy lines and that kind of thing. So there were fun songs and there were working songs. And there were sea shanties, and there were basically 3 kinds of sea shanties. Those which you could sing in front of your mother, those which you could sing in front of your mother but probably shouldn't, and those which you should never think of singing in front of your mother. Some of the larger ships, the bigger ones with the bigger crew, would actually have a orchestra, because most of the guys could play some kind of an instrument. So they'd have an orchestra which would play music on various days, and even like theater companies that would do theater. But so now one of the things, these harmonicas here are not period authentic, okay? These are diatonic harmonicas, which first sort of came out in the 1890s. So this was after the Civil War. A diatonic harmonica means you got 1 row of holes and each hole does 2 notes, whether you blow or draw. Okay, so that's a diatonic. They did have harmonicas during the war, but they were called chromatic. They were much bigger. They were about this big. They had 2 rows of holes, and each hole did 1 note. Much more difficult to play. So, so these are not really period authentic. They were created by the Hohner Company, and for this, Hohner is still the gold standard in harps, although Lee Oskar is also very good. But the Hohner harps, a German company, M. Hohner Company, came out with the diatonic harmonicas in the 1890s. But a lot of us still use these because, number one, it's hard to find chromatic harmonicas, and they're much more difficult to play. So this is a Hohner. This is the classic, the Marine Band harmonica. Again, Hohners are kind of the gold standard. Lee Oskars are pretty good. Although I found this, of all things, Suzuki. The Japanese, boy, they just, they've done really well. They've come out with, Suzuki came out with a line of harmonicas. It's got the metal comb, which isn't as rough on your lips as the wooden comb on the Marine Band. But so, the guys would hang out when they weren't on duty, when they weren't on watch, when they weren't drilling or having to do other stuff. They'd just be hanging out. They would sing, or maybe a guy would have a chromatic harmonica to. That's Red River Valley. And that is a Civil War song. So yeah, so that's kind of what the guys would do in their downtime. The other thing they would do is when the uniform was issued, it would just be plain. It wouldn't have anything on it. And sailors were notorious thieves. Actually, in the 19th century, sailoring was not regarded as an honorable profession because it could be hard, dirty work. So it attracted a lower caliber of man. So, some of whom maybe spent their time making a living on the wrong side of the law. So if a new recruit would come in with nice, new, fresh clothes, and they had these guys who've been serving for a year and their clothes were getting worn out, and they didn't want to buy a new set of clothes from the paymaster, they would steal, the new guys and replace them with their ratty old things. So what sailors would do, again, in their downtime, is they do some embroidery to sort of personalize the frock so they would know it was theirs. Same thing with the trousers. They do, little designs on the fall front and all. So it would kind of personalize, that's mine. If this guy ends up with it, that's mine. So those are some of the things they do. Play music, sing,